This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. I hope you enjoyed this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. Hello everybody, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. First, thank you to 766 subscribers here. I'm actually surprised how many we got since our last Critical Thought. Hope you're enjoying the content here and the rest of the stuff on Game Wisdom. Before we get going, as you know, I've been trying to get people to vote for the 700 subscriber Thank You Let's Play. And we still had the three-way tie, so I figure in honor of Halloween, I am going to break that tie, and I decide I'm going to do the Alone in the Dark Let's Play and possibly Resident Evil 1 HD Remake play as well as our next big Let's Play for the channel. For those of you who wanted the other ones, like I said, when we hit 800 subscribers, which at this rate is going to be sooner than later, I will probably take one or two of this pick and we'll put them into the choices for 800. And again, we'll hopefully have one for 900 and of course the big 1000. What's very interesting, I actually got some good news today. I'm going to be giving a speech to some people regarding putting together some programs about video game and game design next week. And I'm kind of glad I've been doing these critical thoughts as a way to sort of see how I'm responding in front of a camera and hopefully not embarrassing myself too much. For today's critical thought, as we all know, it is October, Halloween, so it's going to be time for one of quite possibly many talks about horror. And for this one, I want to talk about enemy design in horror games. As we all know, the horror genre has certainly had ties in multiple genres, from adventure, action, puzzle solving, and as we saw with Resident Evil 4 and Beyond, it definitely went towards like third-person shooting. But one of the reasons why I want to do the Let's Play of Alone in the Dark is that there are a lot of elements in that game that I still think hold up really well in terms of design, specifically for horror. Now, when it comes to enemy design, this is a topic that we can apply to any genre where the player is fighting someone. The horror genre is different. As I said, while it does have roots in action, you're not really supposed to be as action or as engaged with these enemies as you would in a game like Splatterhouse or Devil May Cry. And because of that, you need to think differently about your enemy designs in a horror situation. Now, this next part I will most likely repeat in future videos on enemy design, but it bears mentioning here. When we talk about enemies in video games, there are several, classes we can talk about. There's the grunt or scrub tier. These are the most numerous. The zombies in Resident Evil. The weird headless, armless mannequin things from Silent Hill. The basic necromorphs of Dead Space, etc. These are the enemies that you're going to find most common. They're the ones who at the start may present some difficulty, but you should quickly outmatch them. The next tier up, we usually have lieutenants, or the higher class enemies. These are the ones that are more, they're not specifically specialty as having a special function, they're just tougher. Crimson Heads in Resident Evil, Hunters actually in Resident Evil as well. Some like the fatter enemies in Dead Space as well. Then we have sort of the specialty enemies. These are the ones that maybe are restrictive to a special area, or have some kind of special ability or perk to them. For instance, we have like the chainsaw enemies in Resident Evil 4 or The Evil Within. Those things in Dead Space that they bite or they inject something into the corpses that turn into necromorphs. Stuff like that. These are enemies that you're not going to encounter too regularly, but they're meant to be a special situation. And then what we normally have at the top are the boss class enemies. Plant, I want to say 42 from Resident Evil. Pyramid Head. Essentially any boss fight in a horror game would be considered this top tier. Now when it comes to the horror genre, these kinds of enemies typically have to be handled a little bit differently. One of the things that we saw with the move to action horror in the late thousands was adding a lot more grunt fights. Resident Evil 4 had the village scene about, I think, 15 minutes in when you're just fighting waves after waves of the Las Plagas. Dead Space as well, tons of necromorphs. Even later Silent Hill games got a little bit more actiony, and let's not forget about The Evil Within, where you're just always going to be assaulted by lots of characters. The problem with that, and when it comes to horror, again, is an old horror standby. The more you introduce something, the less scary it is. The first time the dogs broke through the windows in Resident Evil 1, it scared the crap out of everyone. When we fought those dogs for, time 10 or 11 times later, not so much. And this is why you need to be really careful with having a lot of enemies. One of the things that Alone in the Dark did that I really liked, and what we kind of saw with Alien Isolation, is it had enemies that were designed around a very specific event. And these were essentially one-off enemies, but they weren't bosses in the sense that you had to fight them. They essentially became puzzles in their own right. In Alone in the Dark, there was a fight with a ghost pirate captain, a fight with a suit of armor. Sorry, there's a bug flying around me. And a situation in a library where you were chased by an enemy that you couldn't kill. Now keep that in your mind for the next minute, because it's also going to take us to that example right there. In what we saw with games having these kinds of specific, puzzle fights, it allowed developers to design situations where the player couldn't fight their way out of it. And when they do that, it allows them to add horror and essentially create an enemy that cannot be killed. Another situation like this, even in an action game, would be from Half-Life, the section in the reactor where you had those tentacle monsters who would attack you on sound. In this case, we had an enemy, but the situation played out more like a puzzle than it did an actual fight. Now, when it comes to the horror genre, again, one of the things that I like from the original Alone in the Dark, and even with games like Resident Evil, was that while you did fight the grunt enemies, it was still kept very limited compared to what we saw with Resident Evil 4, Dead Space, Alan Wake, and beyond. And that's an important point of horror. You should be fighting less enemies, but more meaningful fights. And when I say fight, we can also substitute interaction with them. Because again, stuff like Alone in the Dark, a lot of the more challenging situations, you weren't really fighting them. You were just trying to figure out a way to defeat them, either using items or something in the environment. Now, one other area that we see sometimes in horror games that I would really like to see more developers go for is what I like to call the Alpha Antagonists. Think of this as your Freddy Krueger, your Jason Voorhees, Pinhead. These are the enemies that you are not killing. It doesn't matter how many weapons you have, it doesn't matter how strong you are. If this guy or girl, whatever, gets to you, you're in deep trouble. Your only option is to run or find some way to distract them. And very few horror games have gone this route. Alone in the Dark had a section in a library where you were fighting like a ghost who would basically smother you to death. But Resident Evil didn't really do much with that. Now, my example over here, though, has certainly played this card several times, and this is the Fatal Frame series. For those of you who watch my previous talks on horror, and even podcasts on the Perceptive Podcast about it, then you know that Fatal Frame 3 is one of my all-time favorite horror games, and now it's not going to stand. Well, let's see if it holds up. And they just did a really good job of a lot of the essential elements of horror, be it enemy design, environment design, and my goodness, sound design. And there is another critical thought waiting to talk about that game. But the point I want to focus on is the Alpha Antagonists. What they did in Fatal Frame 3 was the primary ghost, the main originator of all the problems, would sometimes engage the player. And this ghost could not be captured by the camera obscura. Your only options were to hide and figure out ways to get around it while solving the puzzles or collecting the items you need. Another example of a game that did that, which I honestly need to play more of, would be Haunting Ground for the PlayStation 2 as well. Actually, the PlayStation 2 had a lot of really good horror games now that I think about it. And Alien Isolation also did this with the alien. While you could distract him, and if you got fired, you could, push him back, if the alien gets to you, you're dead. Now, the challenge of using an Alpha Antagonist type enemy is the fact that you really need to balance their threat level. If they're too threatening, we run into a situation like Alien Isolation or even Amnesia, where the second you're caught, you're dead. Just let them kill you, reload the game, move on. On the other hand, if they're too weak, then they're just simply a little nuisance that you just have to, throw a distraction over there, run over there, and, we got 10 minutes to ourselves to do whatever we want. And getting that balance right is very tricky. With Fatal Frame 3, they usually keep these two specific sections. So, one chapter of the game, you'll deal with this ghost, and then that would be it for maybe a few chapters, stuff like that. One of the things about Alien Isolation, and that could be another critical thought as well, how good we are at coming up with multiple topics, is the fact that the pacing of the game, I think, kind of felt off. It felt like it was longer than what it should be. And pacing, again, another topic. That may turn into a new drinking game for these videos. Every time I have to talk about another topic, take a swig. But sticking with horror and enemy design, you need to be careful with how you're presenting these enemies. So far we've talked about the grunt tier and the higher tier, but what about the middle? What about these special enemies? That's where things get a little bit more interesting. With Resident Evil 4, the chainsaw wielding guys definitely made a presence, but they weren't always around. And that's kind of the thing you want to do. These enemies should be saved for either specific situations or long enough between the times that you fight them that the player has either forgotten them or has, let down their guard. But it's still very tricky to get this kind of balance right. As I said, with most action horror games, they go for tons and tons of grunt enemies. And no matter what the enemy type you're dealing with, the more you're exposed to it, the less scared you're going to be. And a part of that has to do with the build-up and the release that has to go with horror. Again, take a drink because that's another topic. With the Dead Space series, for instance, you are almost constantly assaulted by the necromorphs of varying shapes and sizes and threats. So even when the game tries to slow down to, lower your resistance, you're already still heightened for the fact that I just killed 20, 30 other guys with my railgun, laser, and I think we got a grenade launcher. But that's the thing that Alone in the Dark did well, was that it kept enemy encounters small, and it was more focused about the exploration and, again, dealing with the specialty situations and the quote-unquote puzzles. And I would love to see more horror games go with that. And if you remember my critical thought talking about fight or flight, you still need to give the player some means to get around. It shouldn't be the second the guy sees you, it's game over. Again, good horror and good design is about giving the player these options and then forcing them to weigh them. Do I dare try and distract this guy, but what if he, decides to come over here instead? Do I try to run up and, hit him with my club, see if I can daze him for a minute while I run the other way? Well, what happens if I break my club and I don't have a weapon? Again, when you start introducing choices, it makes things a lot more interesting and adds to the horror rather than things just being pure black and white. Either I hide and I'm safe, or the guy sees me and I reload. For those of you watching this, what are some of your favorite examples of horror design, specifically good enemy design in horror games? Again, because of the fact that we've seen that push to action horror, I'm curious to see what you think about the older games as well as the newer ones. But there's a dog barking out my window, so I think that may be a good time to wrap things up. So thanks again for watching today's Critical Thought. Thank you to 766 subscribers here on YouTube. Like I said, I'm going to be probably recording some Alone in the Dark play over the weekend, so be sure to check for that Let's Play on Monday or sometime earlier next week. Also, as a sneak peek for those of you watching this Critical Thought, I'm in the midst of scheduling another developer live play. I'm not going to tell you who it is just yet, but be sure to look for an announcement in the coming days. So, with all that said, thanks so much for watching. And one more time, if you want to see another Let's Play or vote again, when that number up there hits 800, we'll do it again. But once again, I'm Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Thanks for watching today's Critical Thought, and I will see you all tomorrow with more great content. Take care. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GWBycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.